All right, good afternoon, everyone. I guess we can get started. Welcome to this side event on financing the transition towards low carbon and climate resilient economies in developing countries. My name is Benoît Leguet. I'm the managing director of the Institute for Climate Economics, I4CE, and I'll be moderating the first part of the event. We are organizing this event along with a number of partners you'll see speaking today, CAN Latin America, the Instituto Torquato di Tella, GFLAC, the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, and I4C. The structure of the event will be quite straightforward. First, we'll have a keynote by Laurence Tubiana. I take it it's about needless to present Laurence. Laurence has been a key architect of the Paris Agreement, and she's now the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. And right after Laurence's keynote, we'll have a number of short presentations on key challenges pertaining to the financing of the transition with a focus on Latin America. We'll also have a panel discussion with a number of practitioners, which will be moderated by Louise Kessler, my colleague Louise. I will unfortunately have to leave during the event to moderate another side event. And another very important person in the setup is Chloe. Chloe, could you please raise your hand? Chloe will be the official timekeeper, so that's for the panelists. When you see Chloe wiggling about, it means that your time is about to run up and it's time to finish your speaking points. Having said that, and I guess we can move on to Laurence's presentation. Laurence, the floor is yours for about 8 minutes.
Hello, thank you for this invitation. As you know, even if I don't know where we will land at the end of the week, we need massive finance mobilization. At a moment where the macroeconomic picture has, not never, but is very challenging. We have had other periods, but this one is particularly challenging. The global climate finance almost doubled in the last decade, so it seems good, but in reality, with a cumulative US dollars of 4.8 trillion in climate finance that have been committed between 2011 and 2020, it was a mere 400 million a year. And that's not to the, of course, to the order of magnitude we know. This is far from enough. And of course, we are not, from the financial point of view, an adequate funding to keep on track for the global temperature rise of 1.5. According to the latest study of CPI, we need at least 4.3 trillion in finance flow every single year for the whole world by 2030 to avoid the worst impact of climate change. And the growth projection for 2022 and 2023 are quite bleak, from 6% in 2021 to maybe 3.2%, and now 2.7% in 2022 and 23. So not great macroeconomic space to mobilize this climate finance. And this is the IMF's riskiest growth profile since 2001, except for the global financial crisis and the acute phase of COVID-19. So this lower growth forecast will, of course, pressure everywhere. We put pressure on public coffers, on the fiscal space in donor countries that were already trying to consolidate their fiscal position. In particular, of course, this is the case for all European countries. Of course, this is not a question just of finance quantity, but rather of the political economy underpinning our finance architecture. And that may be more what I would like to insist on today. The debt remains the main instrument of climate finance. So that says a lot, because you know that almost 70 countries are in a line to be in default in the next month or year. By the end of 2020, government worldwide had spent USD 20 trillion on crisis measures, and we can move trillion if we want to choose to. But yet 0.4% of this fund were pledged to governments that needed the liquidity the most. So the imbalance has worsened all macroeconomic prospects. and cause a general risk of debt distress. That's why the IMF expectations are so low. Now, with global inflation and a global recession looming, we're entering in more choppy times with obvious geopolitical repercussions, and we see that the negotiation of debt within the Club de Paris or together with China doesn't bother very well on the capacity to align strategy vis-à-vis the indebted countries. So how do we bring the cost of capital down in the context, which, as we know, is the main issue for investing in the transition? In theory, there is enough liquidity in the market, more than 200 trillions of US dollar held by investors, but we know that the political economy of climate finance still involves huge barriers, especially adaptation finance, blended finance, or even first loss when you want to do the blended finance. And in a way, when you look at the international financial system, and in particular the World Bank, the Regional Development Bank, and the IFIs in general, and even IMF, they are not simply not fit for the crisis that is coming or that is already here. The issue today is not that countries are short of policy options to tackle climate change, rather they face financing issues, struggle to, of course, create the right economic incentive because of the social consequence in particular. That's why there is still a very high level, not only the release of fossil fuel subsidies, they are navigating the economic implication of their net zero commitment. Its cost, its externality, positive and negative. And we are still coming to grips with the cost of climate impacts themselves. You remember maybe more than 35 billion for the first half of 2022 in insurers having to pay for climate events. And you know how little of the global assets in the capital market is insured. Barbados is bracing for extreme hurricanes. Its cost is 1/5 of its GDP. In Pakistan, more than 2% of GDP because of the floods. And not to mention, which is even more important, the human cost. So let's recall that they were all in bailout negotiation with the IMF when this happened. So a true symbol of the poly-crisis. As this event title highlights, a climate resilient economy is the goal, but it is a concept we are still exploring and fleshing out. First of all, how do we mobilize more and better? Mitigation finance remains 80% loans, and we need more grant and softer loans, concessional finance. Adaptation is absolutely lagging behind. Latest UNEP estimates 340 billion annual by 2030. ODA promise have to be met, and debt relief and cancellation for developing countries. We should have well-financed and greener public and development banks, affordable access to long-term funding, align the central banks to guide finance, the supply chain of finance to green activities, and we have to unlock the potential of special drawing rights by rechanneling and use SDRs from developed countries to developing ones. So IMF, World Bank, and regional MDBs have a key role to play, and we need them to transform their action for the climate crisis. So we have to work this balance sheet of, in particular, of the World Bank and the other regional development banks. We need to make the success of the resilient and the facility in IMF and show proof of concept for releasing more SDRs and easing access to them at multilateral development level. So it's incremental change in the beginning and a whole reassessment of the system. And just to close, we are at the moment where is this possible. Everybody sees the inadequacy through all the G20 works and many other elements, that the inadequacy between the financial systems that says they want to respond, but in reality they don't. So we need a reset of the system in all its dimensions, and that, of course, is a more challenging task, but a more urgent one in my view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laurence. I understand you need to leave, so thank you for your words, and I'm quite sure that the panelists will reflect on what you just said. If I may make a very short introduction, and before I leave the way for the different panelists. We've heard, now in the mouth of Laurence, we've heard some of the key challenges pertaining to financing the transition. And just to make a long story short, climate finance is not matching the needs. Laurence said it's far from enough. The needs of developing countries to ensure a transition to low carbon climate resilient economies. Financial flows for the transition are still not enough, and we'll hear perspectives from Latin America. We'll also talk during the first part of this event dedicated to reorganizing financial flows to finance sectoral transitions. We'll also talk about the specific issue of financing adaptation that Laurence talked about. So I will start with Sandra Guzman Luna. Sandra is the founder and global director of GFLAC, and she's going to talk about the landscape of climate finance in developing countries. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Benoit. Thanks, Laurence, and thanks all my colleagues to organize this, and of course to all of you to be here with us today. For many, many years, we have been hearing that climate finance flows are growing and growing and growing. But I think one of the critical discussions that we have to have is precisely what is the composition of that climate finance flows, and particularly who is actually getting benefits out of it, because unfortunately, not every single country is having those benefits. Allow me to start with some information that comes from the OECD that has been telling us that yes, climate finance flows are growing. Actually, some of the main sources of these flows are, of course, bilateral cooperation, but a lot of the money has been also mobilized by multilateral development banks and other multilateral funds, such as the Green Climate Fund and others. But when it comes to distribution, we can see that distribution is not necessarily equal across all the regions. For instance, in this graph, you can see that while Asia, Africa receive a part of the resources, America is not necessarily receiving like in an equal distribution, and you can see other regions. Of course, there are different needs across countries, but one of the critical elements is how all the countries can be beneficiaries of all of this support. If we go to the actual instruments that have been used, as Laurence was saying, unfortunately, lots of the instruments that have been used are creating other problems. For instance, most of the financial support that has been given to developing countries are in forms of loans. What that means, that a lot of countries have to pay back for that support. And this is unfortunately creating a lot of indebtedness in many countries, reducing the fiscal capacity to actually act against climate change. And of course, we have a massive gap still when we talk about where is the actual money. Mitigation is still receiving most of the resources. Some sources talk about 80%, others talk about 90%, but what we know is adaptation finance is receiving less than 10% of the financial support, when a lot of, all of the regions, such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America, are extremely vulnerable, and the fact that we are not receiving enough resources for adaptation is increasing the cost of loss and damages. But one of the critical elements that I want to share with you is the problem that we are facing, for instance, in Latin America. The amount of resources that we are receiving from sustainable resources, for instance, climate finance flows, are just a tiny fraction of support if we compare with carbon-intensive income. This graph is just to show you the difference between how much is coming from sustainable sources versus how much is coming from carbon-intensive sources. So a lot of our economies are still relying on fossil fuels to generate revenue and pay for their bills. In this point, what I want to say is that, yes, not all the countries have the same problems. Really, all developing countries are very different in terms of what they need, but this is a very important point to consider. If developing countries are receiving more resources for carbon-intensive activities, means that obviously our economies will continue. And this is just an example. This is the budget that a lot of developing countries, particularly Latin America, are allocating to climate action versus carbon activities actions. Just the red line is the amount of money that they are still spending in production of fossil fuels. This is a reality. So what we would like to emphasize in this point is that yes, developing countries have to create national strategies on climate finance based on needs. And this is important because it's not only about the decarbonization, it's also about the creating the resilience. And we have to see this as a really holistic and comprehensive perspective. It's not adaptation in one side or resilience in the other. How can we really build strategies that are more inclusive? But also, developed countries and all the financial mechanisms have to react to these needs, because otherwise we are not going to be able to really be effective in the interventions that we create when we talk about climate change. And of course, the role of the public finance is critical, but also the role of other private institutions, because we know that public money is not going to last, or is not going to be enough to cover all the actions. That's why the role of the banks are also critical, and my colleague, we talked about that just now, but just let's really emphasize that climate finance based on needs is something really important in these conversations, such as the new collective and quantified goal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra. Moving on with Diana. Diana Cardenas Monar is the General Coordinator at GFLAC, and she's going to provide a review of financial flows for the energy transition with a focus in Latin America and a focus on public and private bank, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you very much, Benoit and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Yes, I'm going to tell you more specifically about the role of banks, as Sandra mentioned, and Laurence also mentioned in her intervention on the opening remarks. Banks have a fundamental role to play for climate action and for the energy transition also specifically. So just to give you an overview of the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean. So between 2016 and 2021, public and private banks have financed fossil fuels in the region for 206 billion, approximately. There are many challenges in getting this number, so yeah, don't take them like this straightforward. There are many transparency issues to access information, but according to the sources we have consulted, this is about an average of what's been going to fossil fuels, while clean energy only got in this period 65 billion. Zooming into the realities of two specific countries, Brazil and Mexico, two countries that are the ones that have the largest amount of emissions in the region. We can see Brazil, as in the regional situation as well, has gotten 83.7 billion against 22.7 billion for clean energy. On the other side, Mexico got 70 billion for fossil fuels and 12 billion for clean energy. And then if we zoom a bit deeper into who are those actors behind the numbers, so we can see on the fossil fuel side, in the case of Brazil, public development banks show, and especially international sources of funding coming from China, specifically in the case of fossil fuels. We can also see a positive side of public development banks on the other side of clean energy. In the case of Brazil, for the National Development Bank that has also been financing clean energy. In the case of Mexico, we can see that private banks have had a more central role on the fossil fuel side, while public development banks have had a clear role on clean energy. We can see some key actors there on both sides. And then this leads us to one question. So what is needed to shift financial flows from the banks to a clean energy transition? And not only clean, but also just for our countries. So first of all, there are many initiatives going around. Actually, in the panel we will have afterwards, there will be somebody from GFANZ talking about how banks have been working on this direction. And we have to acknowledge this work, especially considering what happened during COP last year. I mean, there was a lot of energy going around this subject, and I think it's very positive that we're getting there. But still, there are very, very important steps that we still need to work on to align with the 1.5 goal, because that's not the case right now. All the calls that we've been getting from different actors, including the International Energy Agency, say that we cannot keep investing, and we couldn't keep investing in fossil fuel projects from 2021. And this has not been the case. We will show with numbers in our reports we'll be releasing soon. And so what is needed? Probably GFANZ can tell us more about it, but I will just leave you here with some key points. So we need fossil fuel financing exclusion policies. That's one thing on one side. But on the other side, we also need more and better quality finance for just transition. What does that mean? First of all, there's a key role of governments. There's a Glasgow statement. There will be a discussion on that on Wednesday for anybody that's interested. And we need to work on regulation. There have been proposals on taxation for fossil fuel companies that have gotten extraordinary revenues from the war and from the increase in fossil fuel prices. And that is not fair, and some calls are going towards taxing these companies so you can get revenues, you can get a little bit of money so you can allocate that into a fund for loss and damage, for instance. And then on the other side, on the role of MDBs, and connecting to what Laurence just said in her opening remarks, when we talk about quality, we're talking about different mechanisms as well. That has been a problem, is a problem. Latin America is the most in that region in the world, also the most touched by the pandemic. And so we need for multilateral development banks to play a more important role in this sense. And we need to go and move forward to reinventing Bretton Woods. That's the path and no less than that. So I will leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. And we'll wrap up the first series of presentations with a presentation by Deborah Murphy. Deborah is a senior associate at the IISD. All right. All right. And Deborah, you will talk about financial flows for adaptation.
Okay. Thank you. It's great to be here to bring adaptation into this discussion about climate finance. I think we heard from our previous speakers that there is a real gap in adaptation finance. You know, anywhere from finance flows, 10 to 20% go towards adaptation, the rest toward mitigation. So I think something we need to think about is, you know, what are the challenges and what do we need to go forward to scale up the amounts of adaptation which are greatly needed as we're seeing at this COP. Now, we've undertaken some research looking at, you know, can you use financing strategies for adaptation to scale up? You know, what are the actual flows of MDB finance at the country level? You know, we know a lot at the global level, but what's happening at the country level? And we've also looked at innovative financial instruments for adaptation, and we have an inventory of those instruments, and you're welcome to scan the QR code on the way out the door to access that inventory. I'll point it out. But in all this research, sort of looking at what's happening with these flows and how to scale them up, I've identified sort of 3 challenges that I'll quickly speak to today, and then I'm sure they'll be addressed with the panel that comes up. You know, first of all, when we're talking about adaptation finance, there's a need, when you think about strategies, how do you align them with what's happening at the national level? So we see a lot of adaptation strategies. They're siloed over here. They're wonderful strategies. They're well thought out, but they're completely disconnected from what's happening in the Ministry of Finance. So, you know, a big challenge going forward is how do we bring the adaptation story to the Ministries of Finance, to the Ministries of Planning, and have an aligned process. So that's the first challenge I'll point out. The second challenge, when we've been looking at what's happening with adaptation finance, it's very project-based, or we'll say a projectized approach to finance. So here's an adaptation project, here's an adaptation project. You know, there's a bit of, you know, adding in money to address climate risk and infrastructure, and the banks actually are very good at, they've become much better at that, I will say, over the past 10 years. But we still tend to think about adaptation projects instead of a programmatic approach to adaptation where you think, what do we need to do in this sector? And how do we drive transformational change by looking at it from a sectoral approach? So that's the second challenge I will bring up. And the third one is that, it's sort of related to the project approach, but rather than this wish list of adaptation projects, we need a strategic approach. So you have these various types of finance coming in, MDB finance, private finance, government finance, and how can we make those work together more effectively? So domestic finance, what can governments do with their small bits of money to incent investment where adaptation is most needed? When we look at international finance, for example, both bilateral and MDB, what do we do with the grant finance? We've got to take that to the most vulnerable, the communities, the projects that have no revenue flows. And then we've got to figure out, well, what do we do with the concessional loans? What do we do with the loans? Where do we, use the banks to lessen capital risk, through credit enhancement, through guarantees? There isn't that strategic approach to looking at how we use these finance flows. And then lastly, like the private sector, everyone, private sector is going to solve all the problems. We'll get that private investment in and adaptation will be covered. Well, I think we have to be realistic. Some types of adaptation priorities are not going to attract private sector investment at all, now or ever. So we have to think strategically about, let's use these lines of finance through the government, through the MDBs, through other donors, the climate finance, where it will be most effective. So I think that's a challenge I put forward to the next panel too. What is that effective use? So, those three challenges: how do you have alignment? How do you get away from a project approach? And how do you strategically use these different lines of finance? And if we can start to address some of that, maybe we can start to scale up adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And I believe this provides a nice segue to move into the second part of the presentations, how to move forward. We'll have three presentations in the second segment. The first presentation will be on pathways to expedite urgent climate action in developing countries by Michaela Carlino. And then we'll have two more presentations by myself and my colleague Sarah Bendau. Michaela is a project manager at the Istituto Torquato di Tella. I've said it before, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Benoit. Thank you for joining us today. For the last 3 years in the Fundación Torquato di Tella, we have been working in the Decarboost project, which aims to achieve identifying enabling conditions to decarbonization pathways in Argentina together with our partners in Brazil and Peru. One main common factor in our three countries is climate finance. Given the global nature of climate change, there's a need for successful transition towards net zero by 2050, both by developing and developed countries. The transition requires urgent mobilization of massive resources, as Laurence told a couple of minutes ago. To secure the transition in developing countries is critical in order to decrease climate risks. However, it had been underfunded in a significant manner. As Sandra mentioned, there is a sizable gap between what developing countries need and the available climate resources at the international level. To close that gap, the international financial system has shown limited effectiveness. That is related to different conditions of the actual climate finance structure. There are at least 4 barriers in terms of climate finance. One is related with the conditions in which projects are financed instead of massive systemic interventions in different sectors. The other one relates to how the financial sources are given. The allocation criteria not always is aligned with developing countries' needs. there are a limited number of financial instruments, and also there are different procedures and criteria to allocate those funds, which are very different according to the donors' objectives and priorities. Given this huge investment shortfall in developing countries, the situation needs to be addressed in an urgent and in a cooperative manner in the international climate regime. To set up the discussion, we need the guidance of the Bridgetown Agenda that was announced by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago. The pathways to expedite urgent climate action in developing countries has a set of options. One is an agreed strategic reform of the international financial institutions of the Bretton Woods system in order to create the conditions to deliver the massive investment capacities needed in most vulnerable countries. Also, new resources need to be available. For that, in order to expand concessional finance, to prioritize attaining SDGs and building climate resilience in most vulnerable countries. To those resources to be available, new commitments by developed countries need to be set. As we have seen, previous commitments haven't been met yet, so new developed countries need to provide new resources. Different estimates show that to achieve the transition in developing countries, at least $1 trillion per year are needed to achieve the transition by 2050. That's 6 times what current levels of investment have been for the recent years. So we need political will and international cooperation to transform the international financial system. The financial system needs to be aligned with a net zero transition, and central banks and regulators need to deepen climate disclosure requirements and increase supervision of climate risks. Meanwhile, developing countries need to speed up their frameworks in order to be able to obtain those financial resources. The regulatory framework needs to transform the Paris Agreement and SDGs into credible policies and develop a structure of economic signals and incentives in order to accelerate the just transition and give certainty to long-term investments. The financial system needs to be aligned with carbon neutrality and net zero business models by providing most favorable blended finance, innovative financial resources to mitigate risks and the risk investments and reporting climate risk exposure. The private sector also has to plan and implement transition programs in order to avoid risks and additional costs related to inaction. Also include ESG criteria in order to assess and manage climate risks, and lastly, to plan and take advantage of new investment opportunities in a context of accelerated change. So in developing countries, each of the main stakeholders has a key role to play in developing countries' progression towards carbon neutrality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michaela. I will now take my moderator hat off for 5 minutes and take the speaker's role. Does this? Yes, it works. So in the next 5 minutes, I'll try to convince you that countries need to develop a medium-term public finance strategy for the transition. That's basically, I mean, what we've heard so far is we need money, etc. I take from Deborah as well that we need to involve ministries of finance and not only ministers of energy, ecology, etc. And my take is that countries need to develop this public finance strategy, which for the time being, and sorry for being a little bit straightforward, is lacking in many, if not all, countries. The reasoning is quite simple. First, the transition to a low-carbon resilient economy will materialize, will need investment. We'll need public and private investment. Now, the bulk of the money will come from the private sector, but that doesn't mean that we won't need public money. We'll need public money for public investments, both CapEx, but we'll also need OpEx, in other words, human resources, but also for private investments, we will need public money to facilitate, incentivize, etc. So that's basically we'll need this government spending over the next 5, 10, possibly 20, 30 years, etc. Hopefully not 30, or hopefully we'll be done by 30 years, but we'll need government spending. In the face of a changing climate, economic climate, the question is, how can we safeguard this money from the governments to fund public investment and support private investments? So we need this first to pilot the transition and not only do basically vote on a national budget year after year, but basically have a multi-year vision. Second, a co-benefit is that such a midterm public finance strategy provides visibility to all economic actors, and that possibly creates an enabling environment for investments. Maybe not security in the strong sense of the word, but at least it provides some kind of, I would say, enabling environment, let's call it that way. And third, safeguard government spending. How much money will the government need to spend in the coming 5, 10, 20 years, etc.? And this usually starts with a very simple feature. This is something we've been developing in France. That's a French example, for example. In France, what we've been doing over the past 10 years is assessing climate investment needs and comparing those needs to what is currently being done and assessing the gap. And then the question is, how do we close the gap? What kind of incentives, what kind of public finance is needed to close the gap? That's a very simple thing, but starting with how much are we going to pay in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Public and private doesn't matter. And then once we've got this assessment gap, the next question is how do we move on and elaborate financing scenarios for the transition? And that's my second slide. I only have 2 slides, just for you to be confident. My take is also that this medium-term public finance strategy can actually support the implementation of, let's call it NDCs in the short term and LTSEs in the longer term. The trick is NDCs and LTSs need to be implemented actions by the whole government, not only the Ministry of Ecology, but the whole government, including the Minister of Finance, who is usually left out of those climate discussions, over a long time horizon. And the key thing, and Laurence mentioned it, it will also have some macroeconomic impacts that need to be assessed. So I see 2 actors which have a paramount role. The first actor is the finance ministers. Now they usually have different names in different countries. Ministers of finance, of public accounts, call them whatever you want, but basically they have a role to play. For those of you who have a little bit of time to waste in the coming days, weeks, months, you could possibly have a look at our LTS dashboard for finance ministers. It's some work we've been developing with our colleagues from Pathways 2050. And there's a first report which is out on our website, on I4C's website. It's basically a dashboard for finance ministers. It's supposed to help them assess, act on, monitor the public finance implications stemming from LTSs. And the second actor we believe has a key role to play is public development banks. And I believe that's a nice segue to Sarah Bendahu's presentation. Sarah is a project manager at I4C, the Institute for Climate Economics, and she's going to talk about public development banks and their role in the energy transition. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Benoit. So as Benoit mentioned, I'll be specifically presenting a few of the outcomes of work we've undertaken on the role of public development banks in the implementation and the definition of long-term strategies. So if we go back to what is the process that provides us with a long-term strategy at a national level, we would like to highlight that it's a process that's quite complex, that involves many actors and stakeholders at country level, that requires the modeling of the emission reductions that are needed in each sector of the economy, the analysis of the vulnerabilities to climate change, and also the analysis of barriers to investment and private investment in particular. So that leads us to the long-term vision of the country with the priority sectors for climate action, the specific targets that are required for mitigation and adaptation, and also the government interventions needed in the country and additional policy measures. So then we get to the last step to define the financing plans and strategies that Benoit mentioned. They require the identification of budgetary measures that need to be implemented, additional sources of funding that may be required from other actors, and also it involves linking the national and sectoral development banks with, plans with the long-term strategy. But as you may see, this may involve an intermediary step, which involves the identification of the different financing options, the investment supporting policy that needs to be implemented in the country, and thorough costing of all the investment priorities to implement the long-term strategy. So where do we see the role of public development banks in these different steps? So for example, if we think of international financial institutions, they may be involved upstream in the development of the long-term strategy, and also in this intermediary step that we highlighted that requires technical and financial capacities in the country, and that involves support, for example, from these international financial institutions. And then when we want to implement them, the different actions and priorities in the country, this involves also support from public development banks at the national level, and the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions that may be involved as well to finance these activities on the ground. So if we recap here, there are three main areas where development banks have a key role to play. The first is the development of the long-term vision for the country that will be the basis for all the short-term and medium-term actions that will be implemented. Then the identification of all the national and international financing sources that may be used for the implementation of the long-term strategy and the long-term vision of the country. And then in this process, they support financially the implementation of these activities. And I'll end here and hand it over to Louise Kessler. Thank you so much.
All right, we're moving on to the second part of the side event. So we've talked about reorganizing financial flows to finance sectoral transitions. We've seen the challenges associated to such a transition. And now I'll hand over the mic to Louise for a panel with practitioners and seeing how all this can be put in practice.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you to our speakers from the first part. thank you very much for attending this session. So I'm very glad to have our panelists for this discussion. So let me introduce them. We have Sagarika Chatterjee from the GFANZ Secretariat and also the Climate Champions team. We have Graham Watkins, who's the Chief of the Climate Change Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. We have Stéphane Algat, Senior Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank. And we have a remote speaker. We have Luis Fierro, who's a green economic policies expert at the EU Global Support Facility for NDCs. And he's also former Vice Minister of Economy of the Republic of Ecuador. Luis, you can hear us?
Yes, okay.
Great, thanks. So the speakers from the first part of the event did really well on time, so we're quite comfortable for this panel. So Luis, my first question is for you. So in the first part, many of the speakers mentioned the role of climate finance strategies. So how, in your view, how can the NDCs and the long-term strategies be better linked with these climate finance strategies?
Thank you. Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure to participate in this event, and thank you to I4CE for the invitation. I'm very glad to see a few familiar faces, for example, from GFLAC, as well as the colleagues from the multilateral development banks. Several developing countries have established already national climate finance strategies. In my view, these strategies are critically important to identify the sources of climate finance, including international, multilateral development banks and global climate funds, but also local and even private sources, to consider the enabling environment that would allow strengthening climate finance flows, something that was already mentioned by some of the previous panelists, the need to develop a green taxonomy that some regions and some countries have already been working on, also to focus, for example, on the role of subsidies and taxes, including the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies and the introduction of carbon pricing. These strategies need to be closely linked to the country's nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as Benoit and other speakers have mentioned. In the NDCs, some developing countries have included a section on finance, including both domestic mobilization as well as access to international climate finance. However, in most cases, there is not a clear link between those identified financial needs and a strategy to mobilize these resources. The link with long-term strategies for low emission and climate resilient development, as well as with the net zero commitments that some countries have made, is even more important, as these documents outline the path towards a transition to low emission and climate resilient development. It will be necessary not only to increase the flows of climate finance, in particular from international sources, but also to reorient the entire financial system towards these long-term goals. This is connected to the Paris Agreement alignment of multilateral, bilateral, and national development banks, who should all be working towards implementing Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, that is to make all financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions in climate resilient development. The MDBs should provide support to the borrowing member countries in these efforts, including, for example, the establishment of national coordination bodies for climate and sustainable finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Stéphane, your team has just released a series of country climate development reports. So what is, in your view, the necessity and the feasibility of linking climate and development targets?
Thank you very much for the invitation. And indeed, we arrived at this COP with those country climate and development reports because we felt that the discussion about global numbers, very abstract, huge numbers, was really difficult to fix, right? It's not easy to find 4 trillion, 9 trillion. So the idea was really to start at the country level and to do these development reports because they are more development than climate. The goal is really to achieve our development goals while taking care of impacts and the need for resilience and the need to decarbonize. And we hope that arriving with those country diagnostics will really help be a bit more concrete in the discussion. in those reports, we identify investment needs. I just want to make one caveat, like those are World Bank Group reports and diagnostics. They are not country reports, they are not investment plans. There is a step in between. I mean, we want to contribute to the development of plans by the countries, but those are not plans by the countries, so they are not supposed to be implemented. They just feed the discussion. But we still identify needs for resilience and to reduce emissions. On average, globally, we find 1.4% of GDP, which is not a huge number. It's something that is manageable. But if you look country per country, you start between 1 and 2% for upper middle income countries, then you move to around 5% for lower middle income countries, and then you get to 8-10% for low income countries. And those 8-10%, it's mostly adaptation and resilience and closing the development gaps that those countries have in front of them. So I think our story is really that globally this can be done, and the impact on economic growth, if anything, will be positive. But those type of investments won't happen in lower middle income countries and low income countries without more support from the rest of the world. What's really important is in those reports, you'll find those needs separated into different buckets. You have what can be commercial and non-concessional, and that's a huge part of it. Then you have a part which can be financed by the private sector, but only if you get some sort of subsidies or de-risking, because of course the global public good contribution is not being paid by the private sector. And then you have a last bucket, which are the really hard stuff, like helping exit coal, helping build the resilience of very poor communities, sanitation in rural areas. Private sector for that will be extremely, extremely difficult. So we really call for a realignment of policies so that the private sector can do what it can do, so that the public resources we have can really be used for the things that cannot mobilize private sector easily. And of course, we come back to our mission about reducing poverty. We really don't want the public money to be used to do things that are commercially viable, but to help poor people. In the report, and to conclude on this, we also stress that financing is a key discussion here, and it's important and it has to be fixed, but it's not all of the discussions. We also highlight issues around the political economy to realign the incentives. So private sector, it's easy to say private sector can contribute, but you need the incentives, and the incentives in most cases are really hard to change because you have incumbent blocking you. We also identify issues around governance and the need for capacity, and another place where grants and concessionality needs to go is in capacity building. And finally, access to technologies and the need to protect poor people or people affected negatively. So we really hope that the conversation on financing can be attached to the discussion on policies. And we really feel like there is this triangle, right? There are the policies, non-concessional resources, and concessional resources. And what you need is to fix those three together. And right now, fixing one doesn't work because you need the two other ones to be fixed at the same time. We can't take that if it's not together. So hopefully this conversation we have today can really try to push bringing the gap between the policy discussion and the financing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stéphane. Maybe we stay on the country perspective. So Graham, in your work in the Inter-American Development Banks, what have you seen in terms of the main barriers, main challenges, and the solutions to overcome them in terms of supporting countries to put in place the policies to support the transition?
So I think I'd like to start off a little bit with the fact that I think that the narrative that we have presently is starting to change. We're moving from a narrative that is really about let's save the world to a narrative about let's save our country in terms of what we need to do in the countries themselves. And once you can change that political narrative, then you're actually talking about ways of getting people to vote for you. The historical narrative of let's help the rest of the world is probably not going to work in a country. We've already spoken about many of the issues here that, you know, climate impacts are real, they're happening, that's in everybody's face, and so there's no question there about we need to deal with that. What we're talking less about, I think, in a lot of countries is that there are a lot of opportunities that can come from the changes that we're seeing. We're also not talking about the scale of the changes that we're seeing as well. I think people like Mark Carney and John Kerry have used the term sustainability revolution, and they've used it a proposito, the reason that they're using it is it's a bit like the Industrial Revolution. We're actually changing the base of energy globally. That's not a minor change, that's a huge change. So when you're talking about what that means for a country, we're talking about massive changes in the country. And it's not just you're changing the energy system, you're changing the energy system, transport system, you're going to change land use systems, you're also changing the financial systems, and you're changing what institutions you need in the country. That's not small change, that's a big change. And that needs to be owned nationally. It needs to be owned by the president, it needs to be owned by the Minister of Finance. This is no longer an issue just for the Ministry of Environment. So that's already been commented here, that if we want to move forward, we need Ministries of Finance with us. We also need to recognize that there are fiscal costs of all of this that need to be taken into account. And there are also huge risks of not acting. If you don't act, what happens? You're going to be way left behind, not just in the adaptation side, but also in the opportunity side. So I think that's the first challenge, or the first issue that we need to deal with. That we need to change the narrative in the countries. The second is obviously, what we talked about it here, is how do you take this policy, this idea, these commitments, these concepts, and how do you deliver them? How do you implement them? How do you make that difference? Again, you need to go back to the Ministry of Finance. They're the ones that control the purse strings. And you need to talk to the sectors. They're the ones that are going to drive the change. Energy sector, transport sector, land use sector. That's where the changes are going to come. And yes, you need investment plans, but they need to be at the sector level. You also need to identify all the policy changes that need to happen, all the barriers that are stopping things from happening. You can't have electric buses if you retain the same policy and regulatory frameworks that we have today. They have to change. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to implement. And these changes need to be sustained, which is increasingly we're seeing as a problem, is that you need to have the capacities in the governments to be able to move the agenda forward. And then, of course, you need to address the implementation costs, the financing. Where's it going to come from? But I think Stefan spoke to that. We think it's more about redirecting finance rather than actually finding new finance. It's about moving the existing financial blocks around. Finally, comment on stakeholders. You can't do this kind of change if you don't have everyone on board and behind you. You can identify who the winners and losers are. You can do cost-benefit analysis. We've done, I think, 4 of them in Latin America. They're very clear who's going to win, who's going to lose. There are clear losers in terms of the most vulnerable communities. There are people that are going to hit by impacts. There are already migration patterns happening as a result of this. So you can do that, and you can start working with them. You need to work with the most vulnerable and the most impacted, and you need innovative mechanisms for dealing with that. In Australia, when there's a flood, you get paid 7 hours later. In Latin America, when there's a flood, you never get paid. You're already in the city by the time any compensation happens. That can't happen. We've got to change that around. But we also need to engage the big winners and the big losers. And if we don't engage the big winners and losers, they're going to derail the process. This is a very political, economic process. If you don't talk to the coal sector, if you don't talk to the gas sector, you're not going to be able to make these changes. They have to come with you in the countries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Graham. So the speakers have insisted on the role of finance ministries and also on the role of national level strategies. So maybe now we could discuss the role of the finance sector. So Sagarika, could you tell us a bit about your work as Climate Champions team and as part of GFANZ with the project proponents and financiers, and what are the main findings of your work?
Great, thank you very much, Louise. I think when I'm just reflecting on what I've heard so far today in this excellent panel, and thank you to IISD for arranging so many different types of speakers here, is that I think the private finance community on a practical level looks for a North Star, like some kind of like number that's out there. And I think this week what we've received at COP27 is that North Star, which is very much in the report from the high-level expert group on finance, co-chaired by Nick Stern and Vera Songway, which sets out in finance for climate action 2 trillion per year by 2030. And I won't go all over that report because I'm sure you've heard a lot about it, but I think it's really significant that it's covering mitigation, adaptation, and nature. And one of the previous speakers spoke on adaptation from IISD about the need to move beyond a project by project approach. So this gives the where do we need to get to in a very coherent way, and sets out what else is needed. So on a practical basis, earlier this year, Dr. Mohideen, who's the COP27 champion from Egypt, and Nigel Topping from the COP26 champion from the UK, looked at the situation with project pipelines and what's happening with climate finance. The dilemma that they saw was the financiers will say, there's nothing to finance, adaptation or mitigation, we can't find the projects. And the UN member states or governments will say, we can't find people to finance, we have the projects. And so we started a series of regional forums working with the COP presidency, the UN system, specifically the UN regional economic commissions and financiers that were fairly practical. And we held these in Africa, Asia Pac, the Arab region, LATAM and Caribbean region. And from this, to cut a long story short, we were able to uncover about 450 projects. These were rooted in country NDCs or regional priorities. And then using our expertise from the financiers, we whittled these down to 128 projects, altogether about 128 billion in US dollars. And I have a hard copy. I know hard copy is not allowed, so I just brought one. You can find these on the Champions website. And this represents basically the funnel for building project pipelines. And just to share a few headline stats with you, and I'll just check. Louise, I'm okay timing-wise?
Perfect.
Very good. So these cut across different sectors. So altogether, the 128 projects from the 5 regions. Energy is about 42%, agriculture 15% of the projects, transport 10%. And in terms of mitigation and adaptation, about 64% of the projects are in mitigation, so as you know, unsurprising. About 25% in adaptation and resilience, and about 11% were across both mitigation and adaptation and resilience. And I think the interesting things are then about, well, can you invest in these today? So the project maturity really, really varied. So about 4% of the projects are operational, 36% are at the structuring and financing stage, 30% have had a feasibility assessment, and about 31% still at the conceptual design stage. And then the other interesting thing is about the deal size. So about 22% of these were in the 10 to 50 million range, about 21% less than 10 million. Just to put, I'm going to kill this fly in a minute, by the way. It's really out to get all of us here. My husband just gets them like this, so if they go here, sorry. So just to put a bit of color on it, an interesting project in Pakistan, which is obviously very topical, is the Living Indus. So this is looking at the ecological restoration of the Indus Basin. Another interesting one you might have heard more about this week is AFR 100, and that's looking to, that covers about 128 million hectares of degraded land in Africa, looking to restore that. And then others included water projects in the Arab region, blue bonds and debt for nature swaps. So really exciting projects. Now, what needs to happen next? So at a very basic level, we found that a lot of the information was lacking from a financier perspective. So then we helped the project proponents of the UN member states by creating a financing fact sheet, and that's available on our website too if you're a project proponent. And it tries to spell out the practical things that a financier needs to see before they can take this forward. I'm not going to talk about this too much more because I think I'm at the end of the time, but just to say that I think what we need to do is replicate this kind of forums approach, bringing together the financiers to give early input, only the enthusiast financiers, with the project proponents from the UN member states or governments to really try to advance these projects further. And everything that previous speakers have said in terms of what needs to happen, the technical assistance, project preparation is needed. With GFANZ, what we do have is a willing group of 550 financial institutions. They're not committing their funds today, let's be very clear, But they were very willing enthusiasts in these forums, and we had several key players. They're at COP this week as well, from Standard Chartered, Macquarie, 91, many others, who are quite willing to engage in this, and much more willing than I think in previous years. So we have a good base here. We have our North Star, we have a funnel, we have all of the fantastic expertise from the colleagues here to really try to take things forward. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Thank you, Sagarika. I think, Stefan, you had a reaction?
Actually, a quick question is the role of the policymakers in all of that, because to do this matching sometimes is because you have just the wrong regulation in place, and that could really help to have, again, the policymakers and the policy and the discussion. So I'm wondering if this was the case?
Yeah, I totally agree. So I didn't want to go over my time, so I was being brief. But we published a little report. It's just to share insights called Assets to Flows, where we gathered together what the financier's practical input was. And as you know, you're completely right. So what's holding back a lot of these projects is the macroeconomic characteristics, a policy regulatory framework, currency stability. So you're completely right in terms of we need the policies to change and to align around both climate, SDGs, climate and development hand in hand. But meanwhile, let's move forward with what innovation we can do.
Thank you. Maybe, Luis, we could have your perspective on the access to funding, especially from the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. How easy is it to access funding? Sorry, Luis, we cannot hear you yet.
Have had some success in the accreditation of national entities, including in some cases private financial institutions. However, more efforts are still required. For example, in Africa, currently there are only 14 national entities accredited by the GCF out of a total of 57 national accredited entities and out of 54 countries in Africa. So about 25%. There are also 4 regional entities in Africa out of a total of 13 regional entities, that is 30%. These include the West African Development Bank and the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Direct access by national entities has several advantages, including a better knowledge of the national conditions, a closer link to the Ministries of Finance and Environment, and particularly finance, as has been highlighted today. And there's also a process of capacity building in these institutions. However, in some cases, it might be best if they partner with regional or multilateral entities to achieve a greater leverage of the GCF resources. I also want to comment on some of the interventions related to adaptation finance. While the MDBs have increased significantly their finance for adaptation, reaching 35% of the financing for low and middle income countries, there is still room to grow. The OECD report on aggregate climate finance provided and mobilized from developed to developing countries also found a similar percentage of 34% of funding for adaptation. And there was a goal set at Glasgow, I believe, of reaching at least 40%. And as Sandra and others have mentioned, the overall amount of 83 billion is still under the 100 billion goal established for 2020 and is also significantly below the annual amount estimated for NDC implementation. I've heard the figure of 2 trillion. There's also the issue that there's very little private finance for adaptation. A recent study that was cited by The Economist this week found that only 1.6% of the money spent on adaptation in 2017 to 18 came from the private sector. This amount does not include the efforts that private businesses are making to adapt their own operations, but still is a very low amount. The World Bank estimates that on average, every dollar spent on adaptation brings $4 in benefits. However, the problem is that in some cases, these returns cannot be realized in a way that makes sense to private investors. But we have to find some way, and I'm keen to reading the report that was mentioned, to capture these benefits that in order to enable the private sector to invest them. For example, some insurance companies obviously will be keen to invest to prevent and mitigate climate risks. And there might be also a way of capturing the benefits, for example, in toll roads by climate proofing this public infrastructure, which will allow, of course, reducing the cost of maintenance and rebuilding in case of these are destroyed. So I would say, in general, there is a need to increase the flows of finance, but especially for adaptation finance. And that will include, as has been mentioned, also some regulatory and policy reforms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Graham, do you want to tell us how you see the role of the IIDB and other development banks in order to unlock funding for the transition?
Hello? Yep, here we go. Okay, actually a lot of this stuff has already been said. I mean, and it's not rocket science in terms of what the MDBs can do to support the agenda. I mean, I'll start off with the whole question of technical assistance, building capacities in governments. I mean, one of the things that we've just recently done is we've actually moved half of our staff, our climate staff, to countries so that they can have direct dialogues with the countries rather than sitting them in headquarters where they tend to have, or perhaps we used to have very good but ethereal discussions. Now they're having real discussions on the ground and moving the agenda forward. We need to put in a lot of capacity building to have the discussions in the countries. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is to build national institutional capacity, build the capacity into the universities in the country, into the civil society in the country so that we can drive these agendas forward. And then it remains sustainable. It stays in the country. It can move you can keep moving it forward. There needs to be a lot of support, direct support, to make sure that we're fully engaging. So when you do the planning process, it's not somebody sitting in an office in the Ministry of Environment writing a paper, but it's actually engaging everybody that's going to be affected by this. That costs money. And then you need to land a lot of this work directly from the consideration of a long-term strategy within sectors. That in itself is a huge amount of work, also requires capacity building and policy change within the sectors to drive, I think, what was referred to as systemic change in the countries. This is not, something that the Ministry of Environment can really do. I repeat the message on the dialogue needs to be with Ministries of Finance, Ministries of Planning, with the leadership of the country. We've set up a Ministries of Finance platform to have those discussions, to basically share information in a South-South sense about, what can we do and what we can do in the realities of Latin America and the Caribbean. The UK may have 70 people working on this agenda in the Treasury. That's not the same case for Chile. They have 2 or 3. So let's be real about what can actually be done in the countries. But it is a real issue for the Ministries of Finance. You've got major fiscal risks. You've got impacts on royalties for exporting countries. You've got fiscal hits coming in from disasters, which is pretty damaging for a small country. And you've got unsustainable subsidies that just have to be managed. Dominican Republic, 5% of their public spend is going to subsidize the energy tariff. You can't continue to do that. But there's also huge opportunities. GDP can expand. All of our cost-benefit analysis show that it will expand if you decarbonize. Also, if you hit issues beforehand, particularly disaster risk, and you prepare for it, you get massive returns on not having to spend that in the future. So this is a fiscal issue. It's a key issue. The just transition is also a key issue that has to be addressed as a whole of government process. And the Ministries of Finance are basically those that are going to green the public finance and also green the private finance by working with basically central banks and regulators to be able to drive the finance forward. So you probably have the answer as to where finance can come from to actually do the implementation. I mean, there's too many numbers flying around the world right now. We've got the Stern-Songway report. We've got numbers from the World Bank. We have our own numbers. But let's say it's $1 trillion for Latin America that we need to find every day. Every year. What's the reality? The MDBs in Latin America and the Caribbean probably could deliver 15 to 20 billion. That's a drop in the bucket. Even if we tripled what we were doing, which would be quite a lot of work, that's 60. We're still not there. Okay, so we're not there with just doing that. I wanted to point out that things like Paris Agreement and alignment and also changes in safeguards can knock out the fossil fuel contributions as well. So those things will come, and they're starting to come into place. Public finance can actually make a huge difference. If you realign public finance, that's a substantial chunk of money. If you can also realign private finance, and just looking at green bond emissions, for example, which I believe is between 30 to 50 billion, that can be ramped up as well. So maybe you're talking 150, 300 billion in between public and private finance. Now we're getting towards the agenda. And yes, we probably need to fill the gap that remains, and then we need innovative, well thought out ideas that can be based on some of the things that have been proposed in a more political context, but we do need to do that. We need to see, okay, what is the real gap, and then how do we fill in the gap? And I also wanted to just finish saying, look, there are pilots out there, there are models out there. Chile is advancing with the agenda. They are moving. Colombia, if you've been listening to what they've been saying here, they are moving. Costa Rica, moving. There are many other countries that are following. Uruguay is another example from Latin America. Yeah, okay. but they're actually moving on the adaptation agenda right now. The other thing is that they're not the only ones. There's actually a series of countries coming in behind that are also seeing the change in the narrative and actually moving forward as well. So, I mean, I just wanted to say that we're seeing the changes happening. Will the changes happen quick enough? We'll see. But the changes are starting to happen, and the MDBs can accelerate that change.
Thank you very much, Graham. Stefan, would you like to add anything on how funding for climate action and development can be unlocked?
Well, I think the key point is really this alignment with everything else, right? And I think that's also one reason why those numbers, you find many different numbers in different places, is because the scope is very different. Sometimes it's just climate, but more and more you see it's climate plus development, and then it's development with climate. Because I think we have been talking a lot NDC, LTS here, but the real prize is the national development strategy. Once you have your climate financing in that document, you're much better placed to get the financing going toward that instead of having it separated, even in a very good NDC. So, I mean, to me, really, the goal is to get started this virtuous cycle where you manage to have this loop of policies and investments that build on each other. And the question to me is, right now in many countries, it's blocked. It's a sort of chicken and egg problem. And the question is, where do I break this blockage? So we have conferences like the one you mentioned, where we can have something like, okay, if these policies change, if this regulation in the energy market is changed, then this is how much financing can come in, and then you have the incentive to really get a change that might be difficult. In some cases, we see the industries really pushing their own governments to decarbonize power, because they know that they are dependent on the carbon intensity of power, and they really want to be decarbonized. And if you have that, again, you get this incentive for the governments to do the hard changes. And I want to stress the role of concessional finance to create this momentum, because sometimes you still have this step that's just a little bit too high. And this is where, in our experience, being able to offer better conditions by blending with climate finance can make a whole difference. And once you have started the pump, when you have managed to change this regulation in the energy sector with that incentive, then you have the flow of finance that's coming. So in this use of concessional finance, I think we have to be very, very careful. We want to use it either to remove a barrier, like to create that incentive to change things, or to target the poorest and most vulnerable, where the private sector will not go. But we have to be very careful that if the cost of capital in a country is too high because of issues around the regulation and so on, it cannot be compensated by more and more concessionality compensating for that. You have to get the change in policies. And so thinking about how do I have a strategic use of those resources to get those big changes, to me, is really important. The last point I wanted to make is especially on the adaptation front, because a lot of what's going on in adaptation is not in all of the numbers we're talking about. It's like every time you have a local urbanization plan that's taking into account how floods will change, every time you have a business starting to adjust. And so to me, one of the big challenge, one is to increase the flow of finance toward adaptation. We need more of that, that's for sure. But the bigger challenge is, how do we make sure there is no investment in the world anywhere that doesn't check for future risks. And so we see a lot of people proposing things. We have been working on this resilience rating system that we have started to pilot for about $2 billion in project at the World Bank. And the goal is really not only to look at projects that try to build resilience or to adapt, but also to make sure all of investments are robust enough to be viable in the future. And the question of how you change the regulation of the financial sector to make that happen without creating an additional barrier for poor countries to access financing, because I think that's the risk with those regulations. I mean, to me, this is really another of the big prize that we have to seize. And I think there is really a need to coordinate what we're all doing on that, because a lot of people are working on that, and sometimes it's more confusing than anything else. So if we can just bring those methodologies together and have something which is good enough and we can all push, I think this would be really useful. Thank you.
Thank you. So we started the event with quite a drab picture of the situation, and we're starting to see a way forward, so thank you very much. Sagarika, do you want to close this panel very briefly by maybe mentioning some of the innovations that you're seeing from private finance players?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to cover 3 types of innovation. So one is individual financial institutions from private finance. The second is more kind of collective approaches and what's happening. And the third I'm going to put as like newer things that present big opportunity sets for all of us. So with the individual financial institutions, and I'm really just qualitatively mentioning things I like. There's no specific analysis around this. So AXA, Unilever and Tikehau Capital working together on a private equity impact fund to scale up regenerative agriculture. So the reason I like this one, it's unusual because you've got a corporate and then a financial institution working together on private equity. The second one that I particularly like is Standard Chartered and their involvement in the Seychelles Blue Bond. And the reason I like it is that then went on to inspire the Belize approach. So kind of has like a halo effect. And then finally, I wanted to mention Macquarie, who have been focusing on scaling up e-buses in India with their Global Climate Fund, with GCF, and they have a blended finance platform. And what I like here is that GCF has $200 million US. It's committing in junior equity, and Macquarie is looking to attract 205 million from institutional investors. So I like this because it's looking to scale up and attract private finance. And then just on the collective approaches, I wanted to mention there's a group of asset owners that are partners of Race to Zero, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. It's got, I think, about 80 asset owners in. And they have a partnership with Convergence, specifically focused on blended finance. So they can go into a platform very easily and just see the blended finance deals that are available, each themselves then choose which one makes sense. And then finally, I'll just cover the newer areas and the opportunities that we've heard about at this COP. So Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, so that presents a really exciting opportunity to build up a market with integrity if we get things right. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, has 2 things. Firstly, a new Africa network that's launched, really looking to engage the continent's local financial institutions, and then a net zero framework that will help in mainstreaming the kind of innovation that we need in net zero. And it includes some specific pillars around enabling and scaling climate solutions and backing those corporates that are both aligned and aligning with net zero. So I'm optimistic that in time we can build on these kind of innovations, whether it's individual financial institutions, collective approaches, or these newer areas to try and complement all the work that you say is rightly needed at the national level and also in the international architecture that we have for finance.
Thank you, Sagarika. Please join me in a big round of applause for our panelists. And now we'll now have a very brief wrap-up from Bernice Cunningham from the Climate Action Network. Thank you, Bernice.
Thank you so much. And they give me a really complex work to try to wrap it up. So basically, one of the principles that I saw is that we need massive financial mobilization. And I think if COVID shows us something, is that when there's political will, you could have massive financial mobilization. So I will say that we have to see this problem of climate change, this climate crisis, as it is. that is a massive problem that is putting in risk humanity. The other thing that they mentioned, and I think is very important, is that they need to transform the whole financial structure. We see in the GFC funds that countries take almost 5 years to get a project. So I think we need to get a financial structure that works faster. The other point that I like to mention is loans. We could not put the financial system just supported in loans because we put in so much pressures to countries to try to work in these issues. And I think the Colombia government have made a really good proposal that is to change these loans, this debt for climate actions, because this will release the budgets in the countries and it will let the Latin American countries invest with their own financial resources in climate actions. The other thing that they mentioned is financial for just transition. And here I want to stop for a minute. For example, in my country, I'm from Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, we have energy deficits. And what the government did is they reduced taxes for anyone that invests in wind and in solar. And in 5 years, we completely changed our energy matrix just by doing that, taking all the taxes from solar and wind energy. And now we have over 50% of energy produced by solar and energy. And I want to give a bad example about that too. Is energy make bad baggage for sugar cane. So they cut the trees, they make deforestation, and then they get the baggage and they produce energy and they call it clean. That's not clean energy. So there's a good example and a bad example how financial climate change could transform a country. Then the other great thing that Graham mentioned is that we could not make projects in offices because it will not be in the reality. And there's when the pandemic was hitting hard, we developed a project that will produce food in a community. And we make this project from our office. And we take it to the community, and then we realize that the community didn't have water. So this is the kind of things that happen when you build projects from offices and not when the needs of the people. The other big point that I want to mention is the long-term system. This is a long-term process, and I think we need long-term solutions. The other big point that I think they mentioned is that we need here the financial minister. Everybody mentioned, and I think it's very important. In countries like mine, the environmental minister have like 1.5% of the budget. So it's like almost they can't do much with that type of finance. And finally, I think one thing that it was not mentioned here, but I think is really important, is the loss and damage finance. We need a new facility for loss and damage, but a facility that could make results immediately. Because when we have a hurricane, if we wait 5 years to get finance for that problem, we will have 10 more hurricanes during that time. And finally, I know everybody has good intentions, and I think that policies should not be judged by the intentions. It should be judged by the results. Thank you.
Thank you very much.